Hi, this is the Slim Continuum from Haken Audio. The thinner and more powerful version of the original Continuum. Like the original, it's what you'd get if a violin or flute and a huge modular setup had a baby. It includes the same sensitive multi-touch expressive surface and the same powerful internal digital synth engine, called the EaganMatrix, but is thinner, has better connectivity, is more powerful and usable, but more expensive. In this video, I'll take a look at what makes this instrument special, what's new, re-examine the synth engine because a few things in the interface have changed, and look at overall pros and cons compared to other synths and expressive controllers. Before I start, a quick disclaimer. I bought this Slim Continuum from Haken Audio at a discount, but still paid quite a sum for it. Regardless, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by people who subscribe to my book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of which product you buy. Before we get into what's new in detail, let's start with an overview of what this instrument is. The main difference between the playing surface part of the Continuum and other keyboard controllers and synths is that the Continuum's surface is constantly monitoring your touch in 3 dimensions, pitch or X, front and back, which is Y, and pressure, or the Z-axis. The surface of the Slim Continuum is made of neoprene, the same material diving suits are made of, and it's stretched on top of hundreds of metal rods sitting on springs laid out across the instrument with Hall effect sensors on the front and back detecting every slight motion. The result is a surface that can detect at a very high rate and very high resolution anything from short taps to detailed pressure to slides up and down on multiple touch points simultaneously. But unlike touchscreens though, you can still lightly lay your fingers on it without triggering a sound, something that I find makes using touchscreens or other capacitive surfaces very unnatural. All this as opposed to regular keyboards, which are mainly on-off switches with initial velocity detection. Now, to be fair, regular keyboards also let you control timbre as the note plays, whether using a mod wheel for the Y-axis or aftertouch on some keyboards for the Z-axis or pressure axis. But in all 3 dimensions, regular keyboards are much less sensitive than the Continuum. On the Z-axis, for example, pressure or aftertouch on regular keyboards, if it exists, has only a very small range of motion, which is hard to control and keep at a desired level of pressure, as opposed to pressure on the Continuum, which is both very responsive and relatively easy to keep at a level you want once you've found it. I've got it hooked up to this module to reflect levels, and you can see I can keep it pretty steady at a desired level and have very fine control over what's going on. A big difference between regular keyboards and the Continuums is that the Continuums are polyphonic in all 3 directions. So for example, pressure is variable on a per note basis. Same goes for pitch. I can move as I like in any direction, as opposed to pressure on most keyboards or pitch, which moves all the notes at once. Not to mention that the pitch bend wheel on regular keyboards has a specific destination, which you can typically set, say 2 semitones or an octave, whereas on the Continuums, you can pitch as much as you like in any direction and target specific notes, including chords. The surface does have a few limitations though. On the X-axis, you can't play notes that are a semitone apart unless you hold both edges, in which case you can. But at some point, if there's an overlap, then then you won't get a note. And while detection on the z-axis and on the x-axis are extremely sensitive, it's a little bit less so on the y-axis. One more nifty feature that's not something you see on regular keyboards is pressure-weighted portamento, where you can glide between two notes on a monophonic patch gradually. Just by balancing the pressure between the two notes. Now, all that said, don't throw out your keyboards yet. There are some advantages to regular keyboards. People have been playing and refining techniques for these on-off switches for hundreds of years. So if you've developed skills on regular keyboards, those skills won't be directly transferable to the Continuum, and you can't always do what you can on regular keyboards on the Continuum. It's easier to play a lot of notes fast with precision on a regular keyboard. It takes practice to do that on a Continuum. And the good thing about the Continuums is that it's not an either-or proposition. You can always connect an external keyboard to the Continuum like I have here and play its internal synth with it whenever you think it's more appropriate. And the patches actually sound quite different, so you sort of get two for the price of one if you use a keyboard with it. On with the overview, the Continuum is equally unique as far as its internal synth goes, the EaganMatrix. While in most synths, patches are created by making connections from point A to point B, often with a mod depth and a mod matrix, on the Continuum, each virtual cable connecting a source on the EaganMatrix to a destination, and we'll go through this later on, don't worry, I know it looks intimidating. Anyway, each such cable isn't just a connection with a mod depth, but rather it can be, if you want, an entire formula that takes into consideration any one or all three dimensions, plus a bunch of other parameters. Again, all this in a single virtual cable. By the way, what I'm showing you on screen now is the Haken Editor. The Continuum can run standalone without a computer. The synth and presets are built in, but you'll need a computer to view and edit the patches and control some parameters that you can't access through the panel or via MIDI. I'll attempt to explain the EaganMatrix later. It's obviously far from easy. Luckily, the Continuum comes with hundreds of excellent presets, so if you don't want to dig in, you don't have to. Anyway, let's move on and take a look at what's new in the Slim compared to the original Continuum. Physically, it's less than half as tall, hence the Slim Continuum, about 1.2 inches or 3 centimeters compared to more than double that on the previous version. And the most obvious addition to the Slim Continuums is the display, the buttons, and the control knob on the left, which, as per my review of the original Continuum, were sorely missing for basic control of the instruments without a computer. The two buttons on the right let you swap individual presets or change preset banks by holding one button and pressing the second one. It takes about half a second to change banks or presets, but overall pretty smooth. By default, the knob controls volume or gain, and if you press it, you can see the preset name. Then the buttons on the left let you change octaves, 2 octaves down and 2 octaves up. And if you press them both together, you can edit multiple parameters by selecting the parameter, let's say bespoke controller number 1, and editing it using the knob. The knob is a pot, not an encoder, so its physical location will reflect the parameter value once you touch it. The parameters you can edit are mainly macros or bespoke controllers, as they're called here, and overall level controls and overall effect level control, as per the old Continuums. If you really want to dive in and edit the matrix connections, you'll need a computer, as well as to access a few additional parameters that aren't currently accessible here. Also new internally, the Slims have 3 times the processing powers, 3 Shark DSPs. This means that you can create multi-timbral splits or layers out of 2 or 3 presets. You could expand the old Continuums, but this functionality wasn't available in the off-the-shelf Continuums or the Continuum Mini. So for example, the patch that I played in the intro is a split between one preset called The Long Goodbye and the synth. Aside from splits, you can also layer presets. So, for example, I've got the French sax preset and Shango bone and the acrylic clock. To layer them, you just pick the first one, then go into splits and choose layer internal presets. And now we've got this mess. I try to play just one and then lead into the sax and the acrylic clock. We get a tri-timbral preset. Now, unfortunately, at least as of the current firmware, you can only control one of the timbres in a split or a tri-timbral layer using external MIDI controllers. Hopefully that's something they'll add in the future. In terms of overall build, this, like the thicker Continuum, is also built like a tank, but weighs a little bit less like one, 16 pounds or 7 kilos compared to 22 pounds or 10 kilos on the original Continuum. There's a slight wobble to this knob, but I'm told that like everything else here, it's built to last. From a connectivity perspective, all the connectors are on the left, starting with power that works with an included external wall wart, 2 expression pedal inputs, which are highly useful here, as we'll see in a bit, 2 3.5mm TRS MIDI in and out, and USB Type B just for MIDI, not for audio. The Slim Continuum, like the other Continuums, doesn't have any CV or gate outputs, but it does have a 3.5mm digital I2C port, data port, which can connect to Haken's own 4-voice CVC module or the Evaton Technologies UCVC module. A single UCVC module can output control voltage for a single voice, meaning 4 channels of X, Y, Z, and W, which is another channel that you can customize. And it also has an F output, which outputs a gate when your finger is touching the surface. You can chain up to 2 of these for 2 full voices. If you want more than that, you'll need the Haken Audio CVC box. By the way, while by default this sends out expression data, you can head out into the matrix and choose CVC as a destination and map out each individual output of 1 or 2 UCVC modules or up to 4 outputs on the Haken Audio CVC module. Obviously, this takes up space in the matrix. Anyway, moving on down in terms of connectivity, you've got digital audio, SPDIF, output and input, and you can use the audio input to route audio into the EaganMatrix and from there to anything you like. Note, though, again, that this is digital SPDIF I/O, so regular analog audio won't work in here. And then finally, in terms of connectivity, you've got both stereo balanced outputs as well as a headphone output. Before we look at Continuum control as a player and as a programmer in more detail, a word about this setup. You'll get a lot more out of your Continuum if you connect a keyboard and MIDI controller to it. Like I mentioned earlier, many of the presets respond nicely and differently to notes coming from a regular keyboard, so it's kind of like getting double the presets. Plus, the Continuum doesn't have an internal sequencer or arpeggiator. Also, all the Continuums and the Continuum Mini handle incoming MIDI notes nicely and separately on channel 1. So you can send in polyphonic MIDI into channel 1 and listen to that, and then still use the surface to play on top of an incoming melody or sequence without the notes clashing with each other. Aside from a keyboard, you'll get more out of your Continuum if you pair it with a MIDI controller. The Slim Continuum does let you access some control parameters, like I mentioned earlier in this menu, but only about 10 of them. There's a lot more that you can control with MIDI CCs. Haken Audio provides configuration templates for a few controllers, including the BeatStep Pro, and Kenton Mini Controller. But if you have a different MIDI controller, the CCs are pretty easy to map. And if you have a MIDI controller like the Electro One that can also receive and respond to MIDI CC values, you'll be able to see the parameter values change as you move through the presets. So you can notice here as I hop forward through the presets, you can see the parameters change on screen, which I think is pretty neat. The Haken Editor can also act as a MIDI hub for 2 devices. So for example, in this setup, I've got both the Electro One and the KeyStep connected via USB to my computer, and it's routing MIDI back and forth to the Continuum via USB as well. And we're getting preset information into the Electro One because I've got that output to the Electro One as well. All this intermingling of USB and audio may create a ground loop noise for you. It did for me, so use either balanced cables or a ground loop isolator. Okay, once you have everything all set up, let's take a look at how, as a player, you can navigate and control the presets. If you don't have a computer nearby, obviously you can MIDI merge a keyboard and controller into the MIDI inputs, or just get a keyboard that can send MIDI CCs like the KeyStep 37. But if you do have a computer nearby, you get to use the Haken Editor, which has a lot of extra features. Navigating presets is very easy. Both the banks and the individual presets. Presets are documented very nicely, so if you do want to jump into the EaganMatrix by pressing here, then you've got a lot of information about the thinking behind the preset. And even if not, there's often documentation about how the individual controls let you manipulate the preset. By the way, I'm using the beta. It's a little bit sluggish. I'm told this will get better in the final version. Let's go through the editor very quickly. You've been seeing the surface reflect what's going on the CONTINUUM surface. Up top here, you can transpose the entire playing surface using this little widget. In case you get stuck notes, which you might when you move the CONTINUUM around, you can quickly refine calibration. It takes a couple of seconds and stuck notes are gone. And you can also set a trim for the surface. There's also a little widget here that lets you add a touche controller to the keyboard. If I go into the touche or touch area presets, let's just pick one. What this does is let you use the left side of the keyboard to control expression. So touching the right side doesn't do anything, but say if I hold a chord, I can play it rhythmically using the left side of the controller. It kind of negates the whole purpose of polyphonic pressure and y-axis control, but it is convenient, say, when playing chords. Moving on to the right, you've got DSP usage for the 3 DSPs and available polyphony, which you can edit, and then additional settings over here, including the manuals and MIDI and global settings that we saw before. The second row below here represents banks of user settings. You've got 8 banks of 16 user presets. These exist on the instrument, so you can edit them over here and then take this on the road without a computer. So that's 128 total user presets. You can either take existing presets and copy them into here or create presets yourself. And you can always save and load presets from your hard drive, as many as you want. Moving on to the next row, you've got 3 control tabs to access various preset parameters that are outside the EaganMatrix. So if we go, for example, back to my FM bells preset, the controls here are levels before and after the master section of the matrix. There's a saturation circuit and convolution circuit, which colors the sound here. So you've got levels before the master going into it, and then post-master. Then you have 6 bespoke controllers. These used to be called barrels. They're basically macros that can control whatever the person that designed the preset decided that they control. So in FM, operator ratio, tone, and so on. You've got access to the first 4, 1 through 4, through the controls here, 1 through 4. And then through MIDI, you've got access to other parameters. Notice, by the way, that as I turn this knob, the loop is closed via MIDI here. Anyway, same controls here, plus the additional G1 and G2 parameters, assuming they're mapped in the preset. Then you've got the Recirculator, which is a fancy name for a bunch of optional delay or reverbs. So the digital reverb, for example. Let's bring it in, make it a bit longer. You can extend it, which lowers the sample rate. You lose some high frequencies, but you get a longer reverb. You've got control of all 5 parameters via MIDI and over the time and the mix using these controls: effect level and effect time. And you can change the recirculator type without diving into the matrix. Just choose one, and you can edit its parameters either through MIDI CCs, like I mentioned, length and mix over here. And of course, everything is available on the user interface. Then finally, you have an overall global tilt EQ, which you can make thinner or bassier. Then you've got pedal values over here. Anyway, that's Control Tab or Row 1. Control Tab 2 gives you access to a few additional important features. Rounding will save you years of practice. So let's go, for example, to one of the string presets. This one is very nice. So by default, the Continuum is an entirely continuous surface, as its name implies. So playing in tune might be a challenge. Obviously, practice helps. And it feels very natural, but playing chords might be a challenge. And take some practice. And that's where rounding comes in. You can activate initial rounding, which will make sure the instant you touch a note will always play properly. I think that's no fun, but the post-initial press rounding will help you out, and there are various speeds here. Glacial might be a bit too slow for my skill level, but somewhere between slow and instant. Instant, by the way, is no fun because that's just plays regular notes, and you lose the whole point of the instrument. But I think around slow, or a bit more than slow, will slowly round the notes out, let you play chords. If I slow this down, by the way, you'll be able to see the rounding both on screen, in the little circles, and on this display here. Center means that you're in the right place, and you can see the rounding sort of catch up to the note. And when you play chords, you'll see the rounding in action as well. Moving on to the right, pedals play an important role here as well. If you have them plugged in, you can choose to route them to a number of destinations, including the bespoke controllers, the macros, as well as sustain or sostenuto. And the Continuum has 2 sostenutos. So I don't have pedals connected here, but I do have MIDI control over sustain and sostenuto. And let me explain why these are cool. So these buttons represent pedals. So let's say if I activate the sustain pedal, it'll behave as you'd expect, meaning notes are added to the sustain for as long as the sustain pedal is pressed. Sostenuto, on the other hand, will only hold notes that are held when you press the sostenuto pedal. So I can hold these notes down, and then any additional notes that I play won't be held as they would have been with sustain. And you get 2 sostenutos. Let me just turn on rounding here so it doesn't sound as bad. Anyway, so sostenuto number 1 will hold these 2 notes. I can keep on playing, or maybe add, say, another sostenuto. Hold both of these, play on top of that, and then release, say, 1, and keep the other. And then another cool thing here is that you have control over levels of sustain and both sostenutos. So I can gradually fade out the lower sostenuto or the higher one, which I think is a very powerful feature of the Continuum. And this works using expression pedals as well. Anyway, those are the important things. You've got a bunch of other controls here. I already spoke about splits and pressure-weighted portamento. And then the third control tab gives you access to a few CVC settings, control of the convolution, which is the character of a sound as it goes into the master and gets out of it, and you can play with this in a preset, and then you've got a few MIDI I/O controls over here. Okay, so all these are the controls that live outside of the presets. Let's talk about how you can create your own presets from scratch or modify existing ones in the EaganMatrix. For this, I'll head out and pick an empty slot and start with a fresh blank canvas. So I already briefly mentioned this. The matrix here is inspired by the EMS, VCS, and Synthy, but takes it a lot farther. You've got sources on the left and destinations on the top, and you connect sources to destinations by putting pins, meaning values or formulas, on the matrix. Now, luckily, there are little tooltips right next to each input, which you can hover and read about. On the left, you've got a noise generator, 5 oscillator or filters. You choose what these 5 are, whether oscillators or filters, by picking from the menu here. You can see multiple oscillator and filter types. So 5 oscillator filters, both on the input and on the output side. Then you've got 3 banks, which can contain multiple different types of synthesis engines. We'll go over these later on. And then you've got 5 shape generators, which can be either LFOs or envelopes if you set them to single cycle, or dual LFOs if you set them to dual. You've got a few optional sources over here, delay taps or the digital inputs. And then these 4 rows represent values that you can either add, subtract, or multiply to any given column. To make a connection, you need to simply click a spot and then enter a number or value variable into that. We'll get into variables in a bit, but let's just start with simple values. We've got a noise generator and 2 outputs going into the recirculator, into our effects. And to enter a value here, you just use the keyboard, and I'll type in a very low value because the noise can get pretty loud. I've just typed 0.01, 1 is unity by the way, into your left ear, and 0.01 into your right ear. And we've now connected the noise to speakers left and right. We can increase this using left and right arrows. And we don't want this to get too high. Anyway, that's a simple connection using basic numbers. I could also place variables or formulas into these points. The easiest variables to use are X, Y, and Z. So if I were to press Z on left and right here, I can control the level of noise using pressure. And you can hear a little bit of the recirculator there. If I move it all the way to dry, then you'll just get plain noise, but let's leave a little bit of reverb. Why not? Let's delete these by pressing delete after selecting them and connect an oscillator to our outputs. Now, we won't hear anything by default because oscillator 1 isn't getting any frequency value, or basically getting 0. So to feed it a frequency value, we need to send the x-axis into the frequency controls. And since we don't have a mod matrix source slot for x, we can just use one of the pluses, look for the frequency control, and place x here. And we can now play our oscillator, controlling pitch with X and level with Z. You can see the oscillator has 2 inputs, one for frequency and another for shape. Let's say use Y for that. Now we can control the timbre using the Y-axis. If I wanted, by the way, to route this oscillator through a filter, I would disconnect the oscillator output from the left and right inputs, connect the oscillator to a filter, a low-pass filter, say, in this case, and then route the filter output to my outputs. So that's about as far as we can go without touching formulas. Let's make it a little bit interesting and dive into a formula. So let's say that I wanted to make my pitch wobble with an LFO. Again, there are no LFO sources here. I'd need to go in and create a formula that takes one of the shape generators and adds it to the frequency of my oscillator. And this is what formulas look like. You don't have to use all these parameters. You can just use one of them or 2 or as many as you like. There are 5 core elements to a formula. X, Y, and Z are simple. They're how these three dimensions relate to whatever the formula does. W is sort of like a catch-all for multiple options. Constant is just a number. So I could, for example, set it to a constant and expand this circle. Now we've got formula A taking into consideration the W parameter, and then say put that maybe over here for shape, type A, and then this will control my timbre, the shape. And W, by the way, is also how you get the bespoke controllers or the macros to control parameters. So I could have, say, controller number 1, control timbre as well. So if I go into here and look for controller number 1, I can now change timbre with controller number 1 or through external MIDI, of course. Anyway, we wanted to get an LFO into the picture, and we do that by choosing, instead of a constant, one of the shape generators, and nothing happens because our LFO isn't moving. We need to give it values in the matrix as well. I chose LFO number 1. Let's give it a frequency of 2 Hertz. Just type in 2, and you need to trigger it as well. So I'll just put 1 here to trigger it. And now I've got an LFO controlling my timbre. And of course I could take this and apply it to pitch as well. You can use the formula twice. And there are a bunch of LFO shapes you can choose from. Now, we didn't get an expressive controller to have LFOs change our sounds for us. To have one of the dimensions participate, we simply have to activate it by moving its value from 0. Let's say choose pressure. Now, this gets a little bit complicated, but you can choose how these interact, and I would need to multiply Z by W to have pressure control the depth of the LFO. And presto, we now have pressure control over the LFO depth. It's always a good idea to save your presets. You hold Shift and press an empty slot, and that saves that over here. You can name barrels, by the way, over here. So just type in the barrel name, and there's a help here. And you can also name the ranges, let's say. Then hit done, and we should have a name for our bespoke controller. Let's get back to the last element of our formulas. I'll create a new one, and that's this thing here on the right. Let's go for a simple constant and maybe pressure control over noise. Let's plug in B over here. Whoops, we don't want that. We want a multiplication. There are a few parameters here. Persistence will add a decay to a parameter, so we can have our noise decay slowly. Then interpolation will smoothen out parameters, both going in and out. And then ancillary will let you apply another formula if you wanted to any one or all of the components of this formula, and in multiple ways, including power and log. So yeah, if you want to, you can certainly have added here as well. So yeah, all this is basically a patch cable in modular setups, or compared to regular synth mod matrices, which typically will have a mod depth, and if you're lucky, a controller. So that's the EaganMatrix, and if it would just let you connect oscillators to filters, it would be nice, but there are, like I mentioned earlier, a bunch of synthesis engines here. Let's take a little taste of a few of them. I won't go through all the oscillators. There's so many of them. The phase generator is nice. There's a Genie oscillator, which is based on the work of George Genie. It's kind of like hard sync, but different. And there are a bunch of examples here. Let's maybe listen to one more. A lot of the action is in all of these models. Let's just briefly go through a few presets that will give you a taste of these. Let's start with BiqBank. If you're interested, by the way, in learning more about what these parameters do, there's a YouTube channel called EaganMatrix Programming by Richard Cram, which goes into a lot of detail about, I think, all of these banks, or most of them. Anyway, Ishango Bone, you've heard this before, it's mainly based on biquad banks, which are bandpass filters that get excited by noise and are modulated based on all the filters here. You can get a taste, by the way, of the circular routing of the matrix. So we've got noise going into a high-pass filter, and then another noise oscillator going into a low-pass filter, and then these two, right, high-pass and low-pass, going out of here into both of the biquad banks, and then that's how those banks are controlled. So it's this circular motion in and out. That is how you use the matrix. Next up is BiqGraph. Again, bandpass filters, but this time you can control them using a graph. And if we click the graph here, we can edit the bandpass filters. Pretty cool synthesis engine there, BiqGraph. Then next up is BiqMouth. Again, bandpass filters, but this time for creating formants, mouth shapes, or vowel-like sounds. Next up is Sine Bank, Sine partials. This is a simple example of sine banks, and you can use sine banks as modulators. So the matrix accepts audio rate modulation up to, I think, about 1000 hertz. So in this example, sine banks are modulators. Then next up is sine spray, sine grains, bird echoer is a preset that uses that, as does bird whistler. Similar. A lot of very interesting sound design presets in here as well. Next up is WaveBank, and I saved a preset here. Organzilla is a good one. Another fun one, I think, is this one, also with WaveBank. Let's move on. Next one is the Harmonic Manipulator. This is a good preset. The Harmonic Manipulator uses very short preloaded samples, 12 raw grains of a sample that's 150 milliseconds in length. And you can choose different ones. So if we go into here, this is sprung, but we can say pick a bell, which completely changes the sound. And all of these work, I guess, with this preset. But yeah, they change the character quite a bit. Tunable tempura. Next up is the Modal Manipulator, and harp is a nice one that uses that. Here too, you can pick from a few samples. Let's go for bell again. Yeah, a bit harsh. Some are similar. Next up is the additive engine. This uses 96 sine waves to recreate samples stored on the onboard memory. Remember, this is additive synthesis. You're not playing back samples. Rather, you're using an algorithm that analyzes the audio and assigns 96 sine waves to it in a way that you can both pitch shift it and time stretch it. Play it faster and slower. So here the y-axis plays the sample slower or faster, and x obviously handles pitch. You can't currently load your own samples into this, but the manual says that a tool for that may be released in the future. If and when that's released, you'll be able to load up to 19.2 seconds of user samples into the memory and scan them back and forth and up and down any way you like. Meanwhile, you can play with the onboard samples, so... Okay, let's quit the babbling and move on to the kinetic engine. So this is an example preset. And if we look at the properties here, the kinetic engine is a physical model. It attempts to recreate what it would sound like if you attached a weight to a spring, put it in a container with a variable viscosity fluid, and then tried to play it with a bow. I mean, we've all tried that, right? And there obviously are a bunch of parameters here. But if you ever wanted to mess with the viscosity of a sound, or any one of these parameters, you can obviously experiment with that. And then the last multi-bank type in the EaganMatrix, other than the CV banks, which we spoke about earlier, is the delays. Unlike the Recirculator, which is a master delay or reverb effect, these delays are applied per voice, which can lead to very interesting results. So this preset uses a delay for carpless strong synthesis. You can obviously play with the parameters. Cool stuff. So that's pretty much it for the EaganMatrix and a taste of the presets. By the way, the exact same engine lives on the CONTINUUM Mini as well, so it's an interesting budget alternative for the CONTINUUM Slim. Speaking of which, let's talk about alternatives, pros and cons. There's a lot to like about the Slim CONTINUUM. Clearly, its biggest disadvantage is its price. Back when I reviewed the original non-slim half-size CONTINUUM, it came in with a $3,500 price tag. Now that has been discontinued, and the half-size slims that are still hand-built by Lippold Haken cost almost $5,000. Not cheap, but considering it's a tri-timbral, one heck of a synth with unique controls, it's still cheaper than a Moog 1. But that said, what are some alternatives to this? The other expressive options on the market mostly aren't standalone synths, but rather MIDI controllers that you need to pair with another hardware or software MPE capable synth. I've tried almost all of them, and I wish I can say there was a cheaper option that provides better expressive control, but there isn't. That said, some come close and all are much more affordable. MPE controller options are the Roly Seaboard, the Sensel Morph, and the Linstrument, as well as Polyend and Dreadbox's Medusa, which is also a synth, but also has an MPE-capable grid. All of these are limited in one or more dimensions compared to the CONTINUUM, but they are certainly better than nothing. Now, you can actually pair all these controllers with a CONTINUUM Mini, which, even though is mainly intended for single-finger control, has a full 8-voice EaganMatrix DSP inside. So, for example, a CONTINUUM Mini with a Sensel Morph is a great way to enter the EaganMatrix at a relatively low cost. Anyway, a detailed comparison of the pros and cons of those controllers compared to CONTINUUM is beyond the scope of this video. I've dedicated a whole chapter in my book to comparisons between those instruments, so check that out for a more in-depth look. Setting price aside, let's look at some other pros and cons. Probably the biggest negative other than price that you should be aware of is that, like I mentioned earlier, keyboard skills aren't directly transferable to the CONTINUUM. You'll need to practice to feel at home here. And just like there are things the CONTINUUM's surface can do that a keyboard can't, keyboards do have some advantages. I've discussed all of that earlier, so I won't repeat that here. Further, on the cons side, the Continuum has no arpeggiator or sequencer. That said, you could of course connect an external keyboard to it with a sequencer and arpeggiator, something that's very complementary, I think, anyway, to this playing surface. If we set aside MPE and expressive control compared to other synths, there are a few cons you should be aware of. The first is lack of quick parameter access controls. This is a player's instrument, not a programmer's instrument, unless you want to use a computer. The added knob is a huge improvement over the previous Continuums, but you still need to page through parameters and can only see a fraction of what's controllable with a MIDI controller or obviously the companion software. Finally, on the cons side, it would be an understatement to say that the EaganMatrix is not easy to program. The sheer number of oscillators, filters, and multi-bank types is by far the largest number of synth engines I've ever seen in one place. Each of these has numerous parameters that you can control, something of which personally I've only scratched the surface. Also, as it stands today, there's no way to directly access most of these parameters with hands-on controls using, say, a MIDI controller. So for example, there's no built-in LFO frequency knob or MIDI CC destination. You need to program the LFO speed in the matrix, which isn't easy to say the least. That said, we're seeing some of the parameters exposed, like for example, with the Kinetic engine, hopefully additional parameters will be exposed at some point for the LFOs, the oscillators, and the filters, so you could just play around with them rather than program values for them in the matrix. One more limitation that hopefully will be addressed is lack of control for the individual bespoke controllers and other parameters when you're playing splits or layers. Currently, you can only control one of the presets in a split or one of the layers. When you're adding multiple layers on top of each other, it would be nice, say, to use different channels to control the different splits. So that's it for the cons. On the pros side, as much as the Continuum has the most complex programming interface I've ever seen in a synth, it also has the most beautifully crafted presets and responsive surface I've ever played. All the complexity totally vanishes when you start to play it. Now, I'm not saying you can't get expressive with a piano keyboard, but when playing the Continuum, you truly feel at one with the sounds coming out of it. Sure, it's not a knob per function synth, but it is sort of like a finger per function one with the envelope controls and LFO controls at your fingertips, quite literally. Most of the presets don't feel like they're out there to show off a synth feature, but rather to let you feel your way around a set of finely balanced parameters that you can control with your fingertips. It feels like they're telling a little controllable musical story with characters that just dance to the rhythm of your fingertips. To me, it's one of the most unique instruments ever made. I'm never selling mine unless a newer version comes along, so if you're near a store or a friend that has one, I highly recommend trying it out. And if you do decide to dive into the EaganMatrix, do check out plenty of patch ideas in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, and don't forget to ring the YouTube bell to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.